Right. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us today. We wanted to just give an update in terms of the work that's been taking place on EV ready requirements and some of the consultations and what we've heard back from some of the 3 target audiences that we've been doing consultations since the release of the EV costing study. It's the 3 main stakeholders that we've been doing consultations with is the municipalities, of course, as well as the utilities and the development community. And I'm just gonna, we're just gonna do a little bit of a report back on what we've heard thus far from each of those stakeholders and what are the leading recommendations moving forward. So a little bit of the agenda. I will go into a little bit about why EVs are definitely part of the climate change solution, but I also will go into the fact that they're not the not a silver bullet. And very rarely do we have these silver bullets that are going to solve the challenge on our air pollution, air climate change challenges that we're facing and opportunities. So I'll go a little bit into that, the role with EVs play in that, and then the transportation system as a whole in terms of meeting our GHG reduction targets and meeting other policy goals related to congestion, and equity on transportation investments. I will do a really quick results of the EV costing study, and also speaking to the role that EV requirements play in terms of driving EV readiness at the time of construction to avoid future retrofit costs. I will go a little bit into the municipal authorities that are available to municipalities to advance EV ready requirements. Go into a bit some of the input from consultations with each of the stakeholders, municipalities, utilities, and developers. And then Michael from the City of Toronto is going to give us a little bit of a background on Toronto's thinking and rationale for moving their EV requirements from green standards to parking bylaws. And we'll be digging a little bit into these topics. At the end of the presentations, there will be Q&As. There will also be some time for Menti to gather some input from folks on the webinar to be able to take us to the next step, like what's next on this journey that we have. So I did want to put out some land acknowledgements. We're very happy to be joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. And I wanted to just kind of add to it that the land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, as well as other First Nations to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes, and acknowledging our codependencies on these resources and this ecosystem and each other in taking care of each other, as well as the land that, that everybody relies on. And I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction on this. I really like to kind of use as an opportunity to increase our knowledge or understanding of Indigenous history, Indigenous knowledge, how we make progress towards reconciliation. And so I'd just like to share this video if it's okay with folks. And I will just...
Well, I think Indigenous knowledge has rooted deeply in many generations of experience in place, wherever that place is around the world. And in many ways, this is why I think Indigenous knowledge derives its core understandings from what it considers to be earth knowledge, that the earth holds the knowledge, that the rocks hold the knowledge, the trees, and all of that stuff, because it has witnessed all of those generations. Has heard all of the speeches and songs and heard all of the ceremonies, so it captures the essence of what people in that place are trying to express, and then inspires people to express that. So it's a reciprocal relationship between the humans and the place. And after being in the place for many generations, you get to understand its natural, empowering cycle that it goes through, because it's very different than around the world. As our cycle here is in a strange situation now with climate change, the flow that our ancestors had become accustomed to is changing. So even now the geese are confused. Do we go? Do we stay? The fish, I understand, are running out of order. The maple sap starts flowing and shuts down flow. So as nature becomes confused, we hope that that core indigenous knowledge that we learned from countless experiences in the past will help us help the earth to get back into its pattern. Because see, it's reflective of us, and we reflect that. So anyway, that's what I think is indigenous knowledge. So therefore, it's usually very spiritually inspired because of this profound belief in the power of place. It has this ancestral knowledge attached to it of the stories of the people, the collective memory, but it also has a witness of change. So indigenous knowledge also represents our experience with colonization, and how we respond and react to that is also an indicator of our knowledge. I think by recognizing the contributions of the past, we get to appreciate the well from which that knowledge was generated. And so therefore we have to say, let's protect that well. Let's keep the ideas coming, so that we want a fluent generation of indigenous people, culturally fluent, linguistically fluent, socially fluent, because we're not done being human. We could still use some good ideas. So I think that, and one reason, looking back, we'll say, to indigenous knowledge, there's an assumption there that there will be something from there we can harvest and bring forward to affect contemporary practice.
Thank you so much for indulging me on that one. I really appreciate it. It's been a real joy for me to hunt down these videos to share. In addition, one of the things I think that's really I'm kind of learning a little bit more as I do a little bit more of research on this one. One of the things that I think is really interesting about this is I've always struggled to try and understand how you merge together Western science and indigenous knowledge. And one of the things that I think is kind of coming forward for me is that where I think indigenous knowledge and where we need to bring that into our Western scientific as well as our mindset is really about the connections to the land and the codependencies associated, not just humans and the animals that we're lucky enough to share this amazing planet with, and our dependency on the resources of the earth and the ecosystems of the earth, but also our codependencies on each other, and how what happens to one of us will have impacts on other people as well. And I think I used to think that our solution to climate change was going to be a technological solution. And I don't get me wrong, I definitely believe it's going to be there's definitely going to be a huge technological aspect. But one of the things that I really wanted to kind of highlight on this one is I think that it's also a matter of finding the balance. In order for us to make the systemic changes that we need to do, we need to dig a little bit more into building our understanding and our connection with the earth and our connection with each other and all the amazing animals that we're able to share this amazing planet with. And I think that's one of the things that indigenous knowledge is so strong in, and where we can bring a lot of that that values and principles into our Western scientific structure, as well as our Western society as a whole. So thank you for allowing me to indulging me on that, and I'll get down to the business. So thank you so much. And thank you, Ian, for throwing in the costing study associated with that in the link on the chats. So I did want to give a little bit of highlight. Part of the rationale for why we advanced this EV costing study is because we know that we lost the EV requirements in the Ontario Building Code. And as when that was lost, a lot of municipalities started asking themselves, okay, what are we going to do to make sure our communities don't fall too far behind on EV uptake and readiness? And so they started asking, what are other jurisdictions doing in other parts of Canada in particular, but across the North America, on what are the levers available to municipality ensuring EV uptake and readiness? Now, climate change and transportation emissions, there is no getting around it. there's no getting around trying to deal with transportation emissions if we're going to achieve our GHG climate change targets. And EVs are absolutely a very, very critical part of the solution, but they're not the full, complete solution. And really, when it comes down to it, we've kind of skewed our transportation hierarchy, where we make a lot of our investments into helping the single occupancy vehicle get to and from the different locations. And in many ways, a lot of our transportation has fallen into moving vehicles and not kind of prioritizing moving people. And addressing those equity issues across how much investments go into different transportation options is really going to be critical to not just EVs helping to achieve our GHG reduction targets, but the whole transportation system being more equitable, giving more options to our residents, and giving more options to people to make choices on how they get to and from. So there's going to be a huge need to kind of put right the transportation hierarchy and not give the same amount of investment to single occupancy vehicles, as opposed and really considering moving people rather than moving vehicles. So one of the key things that I did want to highlight that the air pollution and transportation is critical. It's not just about GHG reductions, it's also about air pollution and the impact that has on our public health as individuals, as a society, and about our healthcare budgets. And Environmental Defense did a report called Clearing the Air that did modeling work looking at what would happen if we switched out internal combustion engines for electric vehicles, and just based on public transit, basing on the single occupancy vehicles, passenger vehicles, basing on freight. They did a number of different analysis, and I really wanted to kind of highlight folks an awareness of this report. It's a really great report, and it's really important for the way they've done the analysis of looking at the benefits of the public health to the public healthcare system. Because one of the key things that did come out is when the coal phase out took place, one of the critical elements that helped to build the business case for that coal phase out was analysis undertaking that it was costing our healthcare system almost a tune of $1 billion a year in public healthcare costs as a result of air quality. That wasn't specifically related only to the coal, it was all air quality implications. And really what that came into it is that if you look at a more robust business case on how you draw the boundaries over what you will consider in your business case or not, and you bring in public health into that aspect, you will build a very, very, very solid business case for climate change and air pollution actions. And I did want to also highlight, we really need to identify opportunities to invest in prevention of health impacts in order to maintain the long-term financial sustainability of our healthcare system. We can't just only focus on treatment, we've got to increase our investment in prevention, and climate change actions are part of the solution to addressing prevention of public healthcare impacts. So I did want to highlight as one of this, I know that we're in a very, very different situation now than when the EV costing study was done relating to the price of gasoline. I don't know how long this price of gasoline will be in this case, but if it continues in a long term, that's only going to help to drive the EV market, and it's going to change very, very quickly based on those circumstances. When you look at the price associated with charging at home versus what you would have to pay for an internal combustion engine. And it really comes down to it. Now, keeping in mind, this is based on, but this is an average price per liter of gas, how it would cost you per liter of gasoline for an EV on that chain. So there's a really solid business case for operational savings over time. In addition, the operational savings of EVs, the maintenance cost of EVs are about half that of a gasoline vehicle. It makes a lot of sense. There's a far less amount of moving parts and far less complications in the engine system than an internal combustion engine. There's already an extremely solid business case over the life of the vehicle. However, upfront purchase price of electric vehicles is still much higher than it is in internal combustion engines in general, on average. And there's really going to be, there's an expectation that price parity for electric vehicles is expected to come. This is only price parity for upfront capital costs, is expected by the mid-2020s. I also wanted to highlight the important role that the auto sector plays in Ontario's manufacturing GDP. It is pretty significant, and it is one of the things it's been really good to see investments from all levels of government in supporting Ontario to be a manufacturing hub for electric vehicles. So I'm really quite pleased about seeing all that one. We wanted to kind of, before we undertook the EV costing study, we really wanted to understand from the developer's perspective, what was their main concerns related to the EV ready requirements in the Ontario Building Code. And what we heard back from them is that it didn't include energy sharing. It wasn't done for any for any reasons, like it wasn't done for lack of understanding of energy sharing. It's just that the Electrical Safety Code didn't include an energy sharing in its code at the time when these EV ready requirements were brought into the OBC. They are in there now, so yay! So there is the opportunity for that one. I mean, it could have been possible to just update the OBC EV requirements, but instead it just got taken out. There was concerns related to electricity allocation costs, and we were going to dig into that quite a bit during this webinar. And then there was, certainly the results that this was also resulted in Ontario falling behind other jurisdictions like Quebec and BC, in particular on EV uptake. And also the EV incentive removal didn't help that kind of situation. But that's where we learned during these initial consultations with the development community. That's when we learned a lot about the utility infrastructure deposit system, which we will be digging into today in this webinar. So we did, as part of the EV costing study, we looked at energy sharing. What is the best balance between energy sharing while still meeting the needs of EV drivers to achieve the large majority of their EV charging needs? And what does that look like? What could be the guiding principles that can be used to identify what kind of level of sharing makes the most sense? Ultimately, what energy sharing is going to be determined by is how far drivers need to drive on the next day. So there was analysis using Transportation Tomorrow survey to better understand how far are people driving in their daily commutes. And we use that as a bit of a guide to provide some guidance on how much sharing will be able to meet the needs of EV drivers while also reducing the electricity allocation infrastructure costs. And when it really comes down to findings, energy sharing should absolutely be a core design consideration in EV charging designs. The other thing that developers also gave us some insights before we did the EV costing was the question of future telling the EV charging market. And what they meant by that was developers were wondering what's the commercial EV charging market going to look like? And they were asking, do we really need EV charging at home? Or can we just rely on a commercial EV charging to meet that need? And there's no doubt that the the commercial EV charging is going to grow significantly. And there's probably going to be some new business models that we're not even probably aware of right now. But it definitely seems that there's going to be a commercial EV charging structure put in place. However, the being able to charge a vehicle at home right now is absolutely critical for present EV uptake. There's no doubt about it. And all the consultations or surveying that's been done with prospective EV drivers, being able to charge at home is the critical factor that they use in their decision making, in addition to costs associated with that. Also, moving into the future, there is going to always be a demand for drivers to be able to charge at home because it's going to be the most cost-effective and convenient option for them. And while the commercial EV charging will grow in the market, there's still going to be a demand for EV charging from EV drivers through at present and into the future as well. All the analysis based on that it has been showing that that's going to be a huge component of it. It doesn't mean that it has to meet 100% of all EV drivers' needs, but as a core functioning, it is something that the market is definitely looking for. So then based on all this, we did do some analysis on this one, really kind of trying to compare what are the costs associated with EV ready installations. How much of it is actually associated with the increased service and transformers? How much is for the EV feeders? How much is for the panels and cabling? How much is for the communication system? And how much is for the hydrometers? So all of these is broken down based on different levels of sharing. And you can see that the sharing also has some significant opportunities to reduce the infrastructure costs associated with EV readiness. So it really does highlight some of that kind of aspects of that. In addition, we also wanted to look at not just how much it cost for at the time of construction, but we also wanted to compare that to what it would cost to retrofit these buildings afterwards. Now, there's no doubt about it, the best time to design for EV readiness is at the point of construction. It is likely, and hopefully what still remains to be seen, that retrofit costs as the market gets more mature will gets lower, but it's never going to be lower than the price of at the time of construction. We also wanted to kind of highlight, you can see the different kind of costs associated with high rise, mid rise, associated with different levels of sharing, different levels of pre and new developments versus existing developments. And then we also wanted to highlight town and row homes to see what the cost would be for them and how you would bring in service monitoring into it and how you can reduce your costs on that one. And then how that compares with retrofitting costs afterwards. One of the things that did come out very, very clearly is that the single family is definitely in a much stronger position to be able to retrofit post-construction. It's still going to cost them a lot more. It's just not going to be nearly as complicated as for the town row homes, as well as the mid-rise and the high rises. And that does present an equity issue with regards to making sure that all residents are having equal access to the ability to ensure their EV readiness over time. The other part of the consultations that took place with the municipalities was understanding municipal authorities for EV ready requirements and the pros and cons of different approaches. There's key things that came out with regards to it is that there's 3 different mechanisms available to municipalities in terms of their levers that they can use for advancing EV readiness. There is the Planning Act and Site Plan Authorities. And for municipalities that have green standards in place, this is one possible location for where they can put those EV ready requirements. Now, there's also the ability to use your parking requirements, via your zoning bylaws to secure EV ready requirements. The other option that was raised a couple of times was the climate change bylaw authorities. This is a new authority that was brought into the Municipal Act in 2017, I think was the most recent update. And what it allows is it allows municipalities to pass bylaws that help them advance the climate change mandates. And one of the key things is that this is still a relatively new authority. There's still a lot of, no one has used it yet. And based on some of the municipalities, there's no doubt that we got to start exploring what climate change bylaws can and cannot do. But it might not be the most efficient way to go about doing the parking EV ready requirements, only because it's so new, only because there are other mechanisms available. Certainly in terms of strength and authority, parking requirements via zoning bylaws were considered to be the top level in terms of being able to have the best municipal authority for securing EV readiness, with green standards being considered less authority or less ability for municipalities to secure that. But again, there are different mechanisms you can use to advance your site plan authorities. The other question, for parking EV ready requirements, The other aspect of some questions that came up from the municipalities is they mentioned, what about the Ontario Building Code? If we put in EV ready requirements, will we be undermined by the Ontario Building Code? And one of the things that the Ontario Building Code tries to achieve is the kind of the maintaining consistent standards. Okay, yes, it would. No, yes, we will go into that discussion, Ian. Thank you so much for that. We will get into that discussion on the capital cost allocations. So I will be getting into that down and dirty into that deposit system, because it's pretty complicated, but we will be getting into it. But we does the if a municipality puts in OBC EV ready requirements, will that conflict with what the Ontario Building Code is? At present, the Ontario Building Code has no EV requirements, so municipal EV ready requirements will not conflict with the Ontario Building Code. So that's the general thinking based on the consultations that have taken place within municipalities at this moment in time. Okay, so recommendations for advancing EV ready requirements. This is about the electricity collocation and utility deposits. I will try and do my best to explain this one, but really one of the things that comes up on this one, once a development undertakes its electricity design and it identifies how much of its peak electricity needs it will need, it sends that to the utility. The utility reviews that and identifies if it would need to provide any additional capital infrastructure in order to provide that development with its peak electricity allocation. If there is an upgrading of the infrastructure on the electricity system that is required in order to provide that development with its peak electricity need allocation, it will actually it'll trigger a deposit system. When that deposit system gets triggered, what ends up happening is that the utility identifies, this is how much it's going to cost us to upgrade the infrastructure. If your electricity use of this development materializes, then the utility determines that the electricity use is actually what is paid for the infrastructure investments. However, if that electricity allocation does not materialize in that development, then more of the deposit system stays with the utility and doesn't go back to the developer. The time frame for this deposit system is a 5-year time frame. So you can imagine that if you had EV requirements and you didn't expect the full EV rollout to take place within that 5-year time frame, that electricity allocation will not materialize in the same way as in that time frame. So what we would need to do is we would need to identify how we could ensure that for those developments that are undertaking that do require an infrastructure investments, how can we ensure that their EV ready requirements are not penalizing them through the deposit system? One of the main things that are associated with how we would do that is that there is opportunities to sorry, I'm just going to move on to the next one. There's opportunities to use load management, and well, there's no doubt there's opportunities to use energy sharing, and energy sharing should definitely be considered as part of it. But there's also the opportunity to use load management to reduce peak electricity needs. And one of the key things that we want to factor in is no one wants to increase peak electricity needs if we don't have to. That's the most expensive electricity. It's the one that's going to, whatever we can all do to reduce peak electricity needs is something that's going to help us all in our managing our electricity system. And load management can play a really big role here. So in addition to looking at energy sharing, you can bring in service management for managing the load and then just use the electricity allocation that's under your peak. And because electricity allocations and requirements are so conservative, there's often a lot of room under that peak for EV charging. And then from there, you could then actually not be increasing your electricity allocation for EV requirements. It would have no impact on the deposit system. And in that way, it would also be helping to drive people's behavior, that they would only be able to charge their EVs when there's electricity available in the under the peak. That's one option for how we could address the electricity allocations costs for the deposit system issues. There's some other ones we will get into later, but this is one opportunity for helping to address that need. The other thing that came out in the discussions with the development community is they did speak a lot about there's apparently some fair amount of overbuilding and parking spots taking place in certain areas. This is not across the board, but what it really means, especially in those areas that are located in transit-oriented developments. And the overbuilding of the parking spots means that there's unsold parking spots at the time when the developer leaves the thing when it gets occupied, so that there is unpaid parking spots, which either will increase but still kind of add costs overall to all property owners in that building because it's all distributed across all of them, or it will cut into profit margins at the development community. You can guess which one is more likely to happen, but that's one of the key things. So there's a lot of value in advancing or review of EV ready requirements at the same time as reviewing parking minimums. And bringing those together, I think, is going to create a lot more of a constructive, cooperative discussion with the development community on this as well. And there's some really good implications that they would have in overall transportation hierarchy and meeting the needs there. So that was one thing that came out as well. The EV ready requirements, readiness and affordability concerns. There's no doubt about it. Everyone recognized that the most cost-effective time to achieve EV readiness, is at the time of construction. And one of the key things that the development community raised is how much parking stalls cost. They mentioned that their clients are often really, really, really shocked at the sticker price associated with parking stalls. This has nothing to do with EV ready or not. It's just the cost of parking stalls and how much that has increased over the last little while. And that's a bit of a shock. So adding anything more to those parking stall costs is something that they were worried about with regards to their clients. So that was one issue, but there's no doubt about it. In terms of when is the best time to do it, EV ready requirements or EV readiness, it is at the time of construction. It does, again, just want to bring in that equity kind of perspective. It's the single family home is the one that's going to have less issues associated with retrofitting. But for townhomes or MURBs with communal parking, that is going to be a huge issue and challenge for them. And it does mean that those are going to be a much more expensive and a much more administratively difficult retrofit. One of the things we did identify is that there's a lot of opportunities for increasing consistency regarding EV ready requirements in Ontario. We did do a scan of what are the EV ready requirements associated with different developments from across the different GTHA area in Ontario, and then compared it to what is what taking place in British Columbia, which is the leading kind of jurisdiction on EV ready requirements. And there's a lot of differences in our EV ready requirements in Ontario in comparison to what is taking place in BC. And increasing this consistency is something that's going to be a really good thing moving forward. And also the leading practice at present is 100% EV ready for EV ready requirements. So I'm going to put this, sorry, stop the sharing. Thank you. I'm going to share that. We're going to go into some questions, but I'd love to turn it over to Michael, just to give us a little bit of an understanding on the thinking that the City of Toronto used for how moving from their green standards to parking bylaws for securing their EV readiness requirements. So Michael, I think oh, perfect. You got it. All right. Thanks so much, Michael, and take it away. Oh, you're just muted, Michael.
Yeah, sorry, as soon as I shared my screen, the mute button moved and I had to find it again. So thanks for inviting me to present, Gabby. I am going to talk a little bit about what we did as part of our updates to the zoning bylaw 569/2013. This wasn't just about the EV standards, it was really about a general review of the parking standards in the zoning bylaw. So I'll talk a bit about how we ended up incorporating the EV component as well. To give a bit of a background, the City of Toronto first started requiring EV supportive elements in development through the Toronto Green Standard starting in 2010. The requirements have progressively gotten more significant over time, but still not to the point of 100% EV ready as of last year. Since the TGS was adopted, the city adopted a climate strategy, which we call Transform TO. It was first adopted in 2016 and it's been updated a couple of times since then. Ultimately, it now calls for transportation to be fully electrified by 2040. Part of Transform TO was also to develop an electric vehicle strategy, and that was created in 2019. And in that strategy has a number of actions that are really directions to the city about what we can do to support the adoption of EVs. And one of those is to require 100% EV ready in new buildings. And the EV strategy called for that to be incorporated in the Toronto Green Standard. When we started the review of the parking standards early in 2021, we thought that it would be an opportunity to incorporate those EV requirements within the zoning bylaw as well. So what updates we actually made, the requirements only apply to parking within buildings. It's not applying to surface parking at this point. But all in-building residential parking spaces have to be equipped with an energized outlet capable of level 2 charging. We chose that level because it seems to be the emerging standard. And in addition to the resident parking, 25% of any other parking in building needs to be so equipped. So that would apply to the visitor parking and any sort of commercial parking. To address some concerns that we had heard in the past and also in our consultations about where EV infrastructure can be installed, we added some new permissions within the zoning bylaw that allow the EV chargers to be installed within the defined space of the parking space. And this is a pretty big exception for the City of Toronto. We don't allow anything else to be located within the parking space. If you're interested in the actual wording, it's there on the screen. Gabby, I'm sure you can share the slides with folks afterwards if they want to take a closer look at this. But I described it on the previous slide. The images here speak to the additional permissions that we added for where electric vehicle supply equipment can be installed within the parking space. Basically, we're allowing it within 25 centimeters of a wall at the far end of a parking space from the drive aisle, except within the bottom meter of the wall, unless it's in the corners of the space. So it's difficult to describe with words, and if you look at what we put in the zoning bylaw, it's not particularly understandable, but hopefully the diagrams make it a little bit clearer. Since adopting this, we've heard from representatives of the industry that manufactures electric vehicle chargers asking us to further increase the standards. We'll monitor this. We're not particularly keen on allowing things well into the parking space. As I said, this is already a pretty big deviation from what the city would normally allow. Another point I should make is that although the zoning bylaw allows electric vehicle supply equipment in these areas, there may be other requirements from the electrical safety code that would further limit where you're allowed to install the equipment. So I should start out by saying that although the zoning bylaw was adopted by council in December and enacted in February, it's not in full force and effect yet. There was one appeal to it. We hope that we'll be able to resolve the appeal quickly. It's not specific to EVs. It's a very specific property and an issue associated with that. So we shouldn't interpret that as any resistance to the electric vehicle requirements. In our discussions with the industry, we did initially hear concerns about the cost of these requirements. Once we had the Clean Air Partnership costing study that Gabby talked about earlier available to share with the development industry, that seemed to reassure them quite a bit, and they could see the benefits of doing the installation of the equipment up front instead of requiring people to retrofit it later. And like I said, we have heard some further requests for greater exceptions or greater permissions to install electric vehicle equipment within parking spaces. So speaking to some of the reasons why we wanted to introduce this in the zoning bylaw as opposed to the green standard, Gabby touched on it a little bit, but there is a perception that the Toronto Green Standard doesn't have as much authority as the zoning bylaw requirement. The Toronto Green Standard is effectively put in force by our official plan, so it applies to all properties within the city. Zoning bylaw 569/2013 doesn't actually apply to all properties within the city. So there is still a benefit to maintain the requirement in the Toronto Green Standard, even though it's in our zoning bylaw as well. There are some operational issues that mean that generally zoning bylaw standards will be more rigorously enforced than Toronto Green Standard requirements. I would say that that is a peculiarity of Toronto and doesn't necessarily apply to other municipalities. So you shouldn't take that as a reason to go one way or another for yourself. We are looking at other ways to verify that developments are actually going to install the electric vehicle supply equipment once they've said that they will. We're still working out what that will look like. It may require an affidavit or similar from the electrical engineer or mechanical engineer for development, indicating that the equipment does meet the city standards. And we're also advocating with the province to provide greater clarity around what the requirements for electric vehicle equipment should be. And we think that there's a great benefit to having province-wide standards. So that's all I've got, Gabby. I'm happy to take questions now or later, whatever works for you.
Thanks so much, Michael. So we do have some questions in the chat. There's also the ability for folks to just raise your hand and then you can ask your question. You can just unmute on your own. But I did want to kind of address a few of the questions that came in with regards to the increased service transformer rating cost category. Does that really just speak to the electrical utility or for just the service cost downstream of the, is it just related to the building or is it a lot related to the overall infrastructure? The utility will be looking at the overall infrastructure that it has in its transformers to be able to meet that electricity allocation need. So that is the larger component. The building component is just the building identifies what electricity allocation it's going to need. And then the utility looks at their distribution system and figures out whether it actually has the existing infrastructure in place to provide that electricity allocation to that building. If it does, it carries on and as normal. There's a cost still associated with the electricity allocation, of course, but there's not going to be a capital cost implications associated with it, just the electricity allocation. So that I hope that answers your question, Ian. The other question was, is there a common standard for EV chargers or does the EV manufacturing have its own chargers? So one of the things to keep in mind with EV ready requirements, it does not require any chargers to be installed. That is the responsibility of the electric vehicle owner. It is just creating the conditions for an easy installation of an EV charger and not needing any infrastructure investments at the parking stall in order to install that EV charger. I know that there is a lot of work taking place amongst EV charger manufacturers to create a consistent protocol across all chargers. I'm hoping Tesla's going to get into that, but I don't know. Tesla seems to be the one that's more about the Tesla chargers associated with that. Michael, is the fact that the bylaw is being appealed result in developers not honoring the requirements? How does that, if the bylaw is if the bylaw has been challenged, does that slow down the implementation of the bylaw until that is not challenged? How's the process for that?
A good question. So during this kind of intermediate or gray area period while the appeal is active, both the old standards and the new standards apply as applicable law. So the new developments do technically have to comply with the new electric vehicle standards. Whether they are or not, I haven't heard, but they are technically required to meet them.
Okay, all right, that's good to know. Perfect, thank you. And are there any other folks who have any questions? I've also in the chat through a bunch of links, sorry, not links, sorry, I'm having trouble talking today. Links in there with all the EV costing study. I've thrown in the EV ready requirements guide link as well for municipalities, as well as the link to all the resources for both the EV costing study, as well as guidelines for the requirements for municipalities on, let's say, EV sharing and how that kind of comes into play. All right. Any other questions from the group? I am going to then share my screen, and I want to move on to some collecting input from folks if I can. Let me just 1 second. Sorry, my computer's just slowed down here for a second here. So if you can go into that link, I'm going to throw it all in, everyone. And this is the Menti that if you could go to. We wanted to kind of get a little bit of insight from the next to-dos on from your municipality's perspective. And just wanting to kind of get a little bit of a sense on where folks are at in terms of the to-dos on their list for EV ready requirements. And I will throw in the links again, just to the resources. And if folks can go to that Menti. Oh, I should also mention in the guide, there is we included Toronto's Toronto's bylaw. So there's as a template for a bylaw that can take place. Oh, perfect. That makes sense. Oh, great. I'm glad Wellington County is looking at green development standards. That's fantastic. All right. Oh, Vancouver. I always like to do this, like things like we always compete, you know, like competing against Quebec municipalities and BC municipalities. And I've been quite embarrassed that BC's been putting us to shame. And Vancouver, I should also mention, is doing some fantastic work on helping existing buildings retrofit and moving towards that. There's some really good work taking place. That will be something that's next on our to-do list, is looking at how to move away from these one-off retrofits to a more comprehensive strategy on it retrofits. But certainly no doubt about it, retrofits would be made easier if we did it in a more comprehensive way, because right now they're being done at a one-off level, and that's the most expensive way to do it. Oh, perfect. So also just Burlington's working on their electric mobility strategy, and then we'll be looking at requirements in the zoning bylaw for parking. All right. So just next one. What would be some of the supports that would be of value for your upcoming to-dos? One of the things we're looking to try and figure out is what kind of would make sense, like what would be of most help to municipalities moving forward on their to-dos. And ideally, what would make sense to do at a collective level? Oh, engagement of developers and education. I think that would make a lot of sense to do that in a collective manner. Hopefully there would be some efficiency of scale associated with that. Yeah, one of the things I might have glossed over and quickly gone through is the deposit system is not something that's set up by the utility. So in many ways, to do anything with the deposit system, we would have to work with the Ontario Energy Board, because that's where the direction comes from. There's a couple of different ways that that developers, if they were concerned about the deposit system being negatively impacted by EV requirements, what they could do is certainly the load management is the major one. And using service load management is associated with that. It would be one of the major ones. The other things that could be done, if we did want to take on the battle of changing the capital cost recovery model from the Ontario Energy Board, there's a couple of different ways we were thinking that could happen. One of them is that it could take out the EV ready requirement allocation outside of the deposit system. That might be one solution. The other way that could possibly has an extending the time frame from 5 years to 10 years for the deposit system. We did raise this with a number of developers, extending the time frame. That didn't seem to be a popular option, largely because that deposit, the money stays in an account in escrow for 5 years. Having it stay there for 10 years, they would kind of has financial implications for the developers. So they didn't seem too keen on the idea of extending the time frame of the deposit, but I'm not sure how the utilities would have felt with regards to, again, it's not the utilities who make that decision on this one. It is an Ontario Energy Board. So if we were to change that capital cost recovery model, it would need to be done with the Ontario Energy Board and not with the utilities. It seems a lot easier for me that service management and using under the peak is probably the easier option and the more convenient option on this one, especially as one of the key goals we have is using our existing electricity system as efficiently as possible, and using the service load management to manage to use the peak. It might mean that during some summertime hot days when the air conditioning's going, there might be a few times of the year where EV drivers may not be able to charge at home, but no one ever said that we had to meet 100% of EV drivers' need for EV charging at home. There are going to be other options for it. We just know that the at-home charging is absolutely critical to driving the EV uptake market. I would say that one of the big other issues with regards to our electricity system is the way, again, it has to do with the piecemeal infrastructure investments that we make in our distribution systems and our electricity systems. Right now, we have a situation where this is being done in a piecemeal and not an overall electrification strategy. If we had a provincial electrification strategy, we would be much more comprehensive and systemic in the electricity infrastructure investments we need to make to drive that electrification. I would say that's probably one of the biggest gaps at present. I mean, there's a lot of gaps, but that's one of the gaps at present in terms of really looking at our electricity system in a more comprehensive way to enable us to electrify not just our vehicles, but also our building heating and how we're going to make the infrastructure grid investments that we need to make. So no, we're not there yet. No, we're not yet ready on managing the EV or just electrification loads as a whole. There needs to be a lot more work in that area. Absolutely. All right. So just one more question I'd love to get some inputs from you on. I'm going to go back. Let's see. How useful was this webinar? So if you could just kind of put that information in. Don't be shy. It's quite all right. If it wasn't really useful for you, don't worry about it. Just put that in there. we're always need that honest input so that we can figure out what we need to do to better help municipalities advance all these climate actions actually as a whole. There's so much to do. So just don't be shy about telling us. I know that one of the key areas that we're also trying to understand is that if it's useful information, but you might not be so aware of how you apply it within your municipality, really one of the key kind of conversations associated with this, this is really amazing opportunity that should you be advancing green development standards, bringing EV ready requirements into those conversations, making sure it's part of the metric is a really, really great opportunity. And there's also when you're reviewing your parking bylaw, it's a really good opportunity for EV ready requirements to kind of be brought into that conversation. We really encourage EV minimum parking requirements review and EV ready requirements being brought together. I think that's a really, really effective way to get the dialogue happening within municipalities as well as with the development community. And yes, I will be sending everybody out all the PDF of this presentation, Michael's presentation, the recording of this webinar, as well as all the links to the resources that we just mentioned, and then sending that all out to you via email. I probably will need till tomorrow before I can get that all out to you in the email, the proceedings out to everyone. All right, perfect. So I'm gonna stop sharing. I really want to thank you, Michael, so much for taking the time to share the thinking and the approach that City of Toronto used. That's really, really helpful for getting that perspective from municipalities directly. And thank you, all of you, for joining this webinar and for providing your input. I will be sending you out the proceedings. I will be sending you out the link. And if you have any other additional suggestions for opportunities for how we can do this in a more efficient or collective way, or some resources, additional resources that would be of value, please don't be shy about sharing that. I really like the idea of kind of doing this kind of collective consultation. One of the things I might kind of ask a little bit of input onto it, it won't stop municipalities from having to do their own consultations with their development community, but it would certainly kind of opportunity to gather a collective input on that. So that might be one opportunity, but I don't think it'll still, if you're going to be putting in those green standards, putting up towards green standards and updating the parking bylaw, there's still going to need to be the need for municipalities to do some consultation with their direct development community stakeholders, because I think that's a requirement. But thank you so much, everybody, for joining this webinar, and have yourself a lovely, it's such a beautiful day. So it feels good to be able to finally get some summer kind of weather available to us. I hope everybody has a great day, and I will see you soon, hopefully. Thanks, everyone.